This is the Sony Bravia 5, Sony's entry-level TV. This is where it all starts. If you want to get into the Sony ecosystem, this is it. And I know what some of you are thinking. What about the Bravia 3? I know it exists. It's there in the showroom. Well, if you look at the specs in the Bravia 3, in my opinion, it is simply a non-starter. It is not even come close to competing with TVs today and what the average living room requirement is. Does not have a high refresh rate display, does not have variable refresh rate HDMI 2.0. It just doesn't have any of that. It is very basic. No, I think if you want to buy into what Sony is developing these next couple of years, this is it. This is the Bravia 5 and it's a mini LED TV. And honestly, the 5, 7 and the 9 are the mainstays of what Sony is offering, and they're clearly jumping into the mini LED side of things. Maybe they see something we haven't? Let's find out. Now, before we go any further, Sony did send me this as a loaner unit. I'm having to ship them back the TV after a couple of weeks of use, and no, they don't get to say what I say in the video. They're getting to see this as you're getting to see this. So let's continue. The Sony Bravia 5 is a 4K HDR TV with 4 HDMI inputs in the back, 2 of which are capable of HDMI 2.1, meaning you can get up to 120 Hz and you can get variable refresh rate from the console of your choice. One of those HDMI ports also supports eARC, so you can connect it to an AV receiver or anything that can talk to the TV, and you can control it all with one remote. Now, it also has a LAN port if you want to have a wired internet connection, and an old school TV antenna port. What is interesting though, if you're in the Sony ecosystem already, it also has the S center channel port, which allows the TV to work with your soundbar or home theater system, provided it's from Sony, to act as a center channel, thereby removing the need for that big ugly center channel that does exist in most traditional home theater systems. There is also 2 USB type A ports in the back where you can put a little thumb drive with your storage and play any media you want. Now, the Bravia 5 does come with stands, and my unit came with the optional wall mount as well, and you can do either one, but bear in mind that when you mount it on the wall, it's not going to be flush. This is not the slimmest TV in the world, and it'll probably jut out about 4 to 6 inches from the wall. So if you're building a TV cabinet of some sort, then keep that in mind. When it comes to the remote of the Bravia 5, it's pretty standard fare. There's really not much to say about it, except it's got a whole bunch of buttons for your usual streaming services, and it doesn't glow at night. This is something I found quite annoying. I wish it glowed at night because the buttons are small. It's difficult to figure out what to click when it's all dark, and let's face it, a lot of our movie watching is going to be in the dark. Sony, if you're listening, glow in the dark buttons would be nice. Now, what's interesting is the microphone button. If you look closely, the icon on the microphone button is exactly the same as the Google Voice Assistant button, and there's a reason for that. Sony TVs run on an Android platform. It runs on Google TV, and I happen to think that is the single greatest advantage they have over everything else. Let me show you why. So, I have this TV and I have Netflix running, but some of my favorite shows just don't air where I live. Enter a VPN. No, this is not sponsored by any VPN, but I do happen to use Surfshark. Luckily, this is an Android TV and it has an app store. Unluckily, Surfshark isn't on there. But because it's Android, I could easily download a local file sharing app that allowed me to send the APK from my phone over to the TV. But when I did so, I realized there's no way to actually see where the file is on the TV. I have no access to the file structure. Not a problem. Went back to the App Store, found a File Explorer. There were a few File Explorer apps on there. Downloaded one of them, and I have access to the entire thing, including the APK I just sent. One click on the APK and Surfshark VPN was installed, and I can now watch videos from anywhere. Again, this is not sponsored. I'm just saying the convenience of having an Android-based system is incredible. The flexibility it gives you, I for one would hate to go back to my current TV, which doesn't have Android TV. So I think Sony's done a very smart thing by going with this ecosystem. Oh, and just out of curiosity, if you're wondering how much storage there is on the TV, it's about 17 GB, so you're not going to run out of it anytime soon by installing a few more apps. There you go. Now, there's not much to say about the interface. There's the usual suite of recommendations coming from different streaming services, which honestly I just ignore. I have my For Me apps, and that's it. That's what I use. However, there is a live tab which you can use to have some free to play Google TV channels that will give you news and sports and such if you want. Now, the interface is nothing to write home about. It's simple, it's snappy, and I felt no real lag while using the remote. However, compared to some other brands, I will say when I'm trying to input text, it would be very nice if this were just a live cursor. You know which brand I'm talking about. That's the thing I miss switching to the Sony. It's a little bit cumbersome, but overall it works as intended. But enough of all that, let's talk about the picture. Now, this is a 4K panel and it's a mini LED panel. This is not an OLED display, in case you were wondering, because Sony is betting hard on mini LEDs. In fact, most of their new lineup, the Bravia 5, 7 and 9 are mini LED, the only exception to which is a Bravia 8, which is on its second generation, which is OLED. Yes, Sony's naming convention is legendary, and this apparently just extends to all its product categories. Nonetheless, the 5 is the entry-level mini LED display, which is an evolution of your traditional LCD sort of display, which we've begun to call LED displays in the last decade. What this does and what this promises is better colors, more color accuracy, and just better defined white and black. So higher contrast, basically. And to be honest, I was very impressed. Now, there are a couple of drawbacks that I will bring to your attention, but I must say, when I was comparing this with my OLED panel, after tinkering a bit and bringing the colors just to where I wanted them, I could honestly say that this is not quite the same experience as OLED, but it's a lot better than I thought it would be. Now, I never use the standard picture profile mode because I find in pretty much all televisions, it's just not very accurate. It's something they think the user wants. Maybe it's a popular kind of color gamut, I don't know. But every TV will have a movie or cinema setting, and the Sony Bravia 5 is no exception. The cinema setting provided exceptionally better quality colors. However, there is also a professional mode, and this is the one I used, and I'll run you through the settings I used to dial it in. Normally, when you go into professional, it will reduce your brightness all the way down. If you do nothing else, this will be far too dim for a brightly lit environment. It might work at night, but during the day, it'll be too dim. What you want to do is, for SDR, I just max the brightness out, but for HDR content, which the slider changes depending on what you're watching. So if you go into Netflix, for example, it'll show you an HDR slider. For HDR content, I find the brightness to be best at about 35. I also adjust the auto local dimming to high and the peak luminance to high to get the most out of the panel. But what is interesting is, if you do nothing else, if you just leave it like that, color accuracy is pretty darn good. Colors are lifelike, not over exaggerated, not oversaturated like you would find on the showroom floor. And I found the viewing experience to be already quite decent. However, there are a couple of more things that I'd like to go into. For instance, the black level. Normally it's at 50. I would really recommend punching it down to about 48. It's a small difference, but it enables black to be just that little bit deeper, which we'll get back to in a second. Now, if you're watching Netflix or Prime Video, which there's a good chance you are, then the Sony TV actually supports color calibrated modes for those apps. In these modes, the app takes over control of your panel and prescribes the best settings. And honestly, the results are really, really good. However, not every app is built equally. For example, if you're in Prime Video, then the app takes over full control and does not give you any of these settings. So you just sit back and enjoy your content. If, however, you're on Netflix, then it gives you some control back. And in that setting, what I would recommend is you set your brightness to about 35. I found this worked for both light, bright living rooms like this and for night modes. Then you go down to your black levels and bring it down to 48 again. This really, really did help get that nice, relatively punchy blacks and a little more contrast, which I really enjoyed, and I think you might as well, given the characteristics of this panel. Again, we'll get back to that in just a minute. The only other thing I changed was the motion setting, and that honestly I left it on default mostly, but for 24 frames per second content you may increase that to 1. If you increase the motion setting to 2 or 3, then it looks very soap opera-like, and I would not recommend that. By itself, Sony TVs are known for their motion handling, and I gotta say, this is probably one of the better 24 FPS images that I have seen, or videos that I have seen, because it is generally pretty judder free and a significant step up from my other OLED panel where I have to introduce smoothing. Here I didn't feel the need to, but as an option, if you want that just that little bit smoother, you could improve that motion to 1, motion handling to 1, and it just makes that just that little bit smoother and creamier. I'm all for it. Now, if I did nothing else alone, I would say for a vast majority of people, this color accuracy was fantastic. However, if you wanted to tinker a little more, you have a couple of options. Not only does Sony give you a surprisingly wide gamut of features, get it? Gamut of features? It's a color calibration joke. Never mind. It's a lot of control they give you, and you can tune it to just the way you want it. And if you happen to be in the market for a colorimeter like the one from Calibrite, then that will only help you fine-tune things even better. If you're hiring a professional, they too, I think, will be quite happy with the level of control you get over here. However, if you want a hassle-free color correction option and if you want to get it just right, the Sony TV actually supports Calman color correction. It's a software which you'll have to use with a colorimeter, but everything happens automatically. It uploads a profile onto the Sony TV and color corrects, which is, I mean, honestly quite impressive. Their dedication to getting colors just right is a refreshing change from a lot of other TV brands, and I love it. Oh, and because this is YouTube, I am constitutionally obligated to ask you to like and subscribe, because apparently it's worth reminding people. I had to do it, I did it. Hopefully you'll do it too. Okay. Now, you also have a gaming mode where basically you've got different types of games that you can set, or you can set it in auto. For FPS games, of course, it would prioritize low latency. For other games, it might prioritize punchier colors and so on. But what this basically does is allow you to watch 120 Hz content with the minimum input lag possible. Now, in my experience, there was a little bit of smearing. I find OLED TVs to be superior in this respect, and I think Sony needs to work on this a little bit. However, you do have the option of black frame insertion, and what this does is every few frames it inserts a black frame, refreshes the screen, and reduces your perceived motion blur. Using it on setting 1 doesn't really make a difference. It does make it sharper and it does make it nicer, but 2 or 3 will significantly reduce the brightness of your image also, so beware. Now, all this aside, when I was actually watching content, how did it actually perform? And to be honest, very well, but it's a mixed bag with a couple of things that I think are very worth mentioning. And number one is that comparing to a OLED panel, a previous generation flagship OLED panel, which I also happen to have access to at home, I found that the colors were rich, the colors were accurate, and honestly highlights were handled really well, and the dark parts of the image also weren't crushed. Like, there was detail in them just as much as the OLED panel was, perhaps even a smidge more in some cases, which is really nice. HDR performance was fantastic, and the places that were supposed to get really bright got really bright without too much spillage. In fact, without very much spillage at all. I don't know how many dimming zones there are in this. I didn't bother because the image was just that much nicer than I expected going into this, and I was very impressed. However, there are a couple of things that are worth noting. Compared to an OLED panel, the edges of everything on your screen or everything on your image will be less well defined on this TV, and that probably comes down to the sheer number of dimming zones on an OLED panel, where every pixel can be fully dimmed to an absolute black. This doesn't work that way, and therefore there's a little bit of spillage, very small. You can't really notice it from far away, but the edges of things are just that less well defined. Also, if you've got a completely black screen, you'll notice that on this panel, the black levels are not evenly spread out. It's just some parts are a little brighter lit than others, and that comes down to quality of production, and I think this being the entry level, Sony is letting that go to some degree. Not ideal, worth reporting, but if you're watching bright content, chances are you're not going to notice that. What you definitely will notice is that blacks, well, they simply don't get fully black. And if you go to a showroom and you compare that with an OLED screen, that's something the regular customer will definitely notice. And in a dark room, Yeah, the dark portions of the screen, they get darker than I remembered from the older style LCD TVs, but not as dark as the OLED, and I don't think it can quite compete there. But where it does compete is motion handling, and just the colors and how it handles HDR content is really, really quite impressive. The one other thing worth mentioning, and this is a big bugbear of mine, is that this is not a glossy screen. It's a sort of a matte screen. And the thing I noticed the most was whenever there was a light source that reflected from the screen to your eyes, this didn't handle it very well. Not only would it reflect the light source, be it a window or a lamp, it would also disperse it, and it sort of blooms out onto the film of the screen, and that is severely distracting. In fact, that is probably going to distract you more and reduce from your perceived picture quality than anything else the panel is doing. Oh, and I nearly forgot, there's one other issue that I absolutely have to mention with the picture, and that is to do with viewing angles. Sony uses a VA panel, and one of the characteristics of the VA panel is, yes, it gets bright and it can handle high motion and all that, but it has a very poor viewing angle. So if you're plus or minus 30 degrees from the center of the screen, so you're sitting on either end of your couch, no problem, your image is going to be fine. But if you're anything more than 35-40 degrees off, if someone's on the corner of your living room watching TV on this panel, it's going to seem really, really off. The colors completely change, and it's not going to be a pleasant viewing experience. The farther you go off axis, the worse it gets. There are a lot of panels these days that don't do that. This is not one of them. But before we explore that, let's talk about the audio. Like it or not, a lot of people have soundbars these days, but a lot of people, when they've spent a decent amount of money on a TV from a premium brand like Sony, might just want to see if they can get away with the speakers. Now, when you first set up this TV, it calibrates audio to your room. So what it does is it emits a series of chirps from its speakers, and it records those chirps with the microphone that's in this remote. And they figure out what the room is doing to that, and then they calibrate your speakers accordingly. Now, and before that, you have to also tell it whether it's on the stand or on the wall, and it makes some adjustments accordingly. What I've done is I've actually measured the audio performance after calibration in my room, and the results were interesting, but they make sense. So what I noticed was that the mid-range was supremely flat and linear, more so than I've heard from many other TVs, and that is really, really cool. However, there was way too much treble, if I'm being honest, and way too little bass. For some reason, I don't know why, they elected for the TV to not have enough bass, even though it is capable of a little more. And the end result is vocals tend to seem thin and anemic, even though they were very clear and they were good. Mid-range is very good, but it just lacks the heft, and there is basically no bass out of the box. And too much treble. Not a great sonic experience. However, I've taken the liberty of building a little EQ profile for you. I'll put it up on the screen now. You can take a screenshot. If you have a Bravia 5, try this out. What this will do is raise the bass, lower the treble, leave the mids where they are, and what you effectively get is a little more bass for a little more theatrical impact, a little more heft when it comes to vocals and anything else in the mid-range because of that increased lower mid bass region, and reduced treble so it doesn't bother you the way it bothered me. And the end result is acceptable. It is not going to blow you away, but it'll certainly do better than a lot of other TVs I know who have very, very wonky frequency responses. This was not bad. However, I cannot stress how important it would be, how game-changing it would be for you to get just a soundbar and a subwoofer, if nothing else. Or what I recommend is a pair of stereo speakers that can take audio output from the TV via HDMI or optical input. There are a lot of speakers that will do this for you, and you can find them on Amazon or your local marketplace. But the difference is going to be staggering. Bear in mind that if you use speakers, you have to calibrate them yourself. If you want a hassle-free experience, the Sony gives you, along with my EQ, I think gives you reasonable sound. That's the best I can give it. So then we come to the all-important question, who is this TV for? Do I recommend it? Should you buy it? Well, if you're in the market for a TV and you've got mini LED and OLED options at the same price point, I think you have to be cognizant of the limitations of this panel versus OLED and the trade-offs. You're not going to get those inky blacks, but compared to a lot of other OLED panels, this is going to get brighter where it needs to get brighter. that is a trade-off that you have to decide if you're okay with to get the mini LED. What I think is that what you get is fantastic color accuracy and the ability to get phenomenal color accuracy, almost reference level monitor color accuracy out of this TV. You get the ability to use Android TV, which is a godsend as far as I'm concerned, and it gives you just all the flexibility you could hope for in a TV. And finally, you get into the Sony ecosystem. I think that the ability of this TV to work with the rest of the Sony ecosystem as a center channel and integrate well with their home theater systems is probably going to entice a lot of people to go for this, because then they can build out an entire system that's small, minimalist, and frankly pretty good. Their 360-degree reality audio is surprisingly quite capable, and I think if you have a chance to go and experience it, you should go check it out. However, Sony TVs do come at a little bit of a cost, and they're not cheap. You get color accuracy for that cost, you get motion handling for that cost, and to be fair, the Bravia 5 at the very bottom of their lineup delivers on both those fronts. If, however, you are shopping for a panel from last year, it is possible to get some seriously good options from other OLED panels at cheaper rates this year, so that's a bargain you must always keep in mind, as long as you don't mind last year's model. Now, if you are looking at mini LED and you're convinced of the benefits of mini LED, then between the 5, 7 and 9, I would say explore the option of going up to the 7 or the 9. I'm not saying that because Sony's sending me their TVs, I'm saying that because the difference to my eyes was noticeable. In fact, the 7 might be a fantastic sweet spot. It's not cheap, but it's kind of the best of both worlds. What I would absolutely not recommend is that you go for the Bravia 3. It is simply not acceptable as far as I'm concerned by today's TV standards. So there you have it, the Bravia 5. Would you buy it? Would you consider buying mini LED panels given the push that Sony is giving it? Tell me in the comments down below, and tell me how I did. This was my first TV review on this channel, and tell me what I could do better. But because it's YouTube, it's constitutionally obligated that I ask you to like and subscribe, because, you know, YouTube. All right. I hope that added some value. I'll see you in the next video. Stay happy, stay peaceful, stay colorful. Namaste.